joining us now to discuss is Penn State Dickinson law professor Tonya Evans. Professor Evans, thank you for joining us. All right, so there you heard CFTC Chair Rosenvenom asking Congress as well for broader authority to directly oversee spot cash market exchanges and ensure no gaps exist in an upcoming crypto overhaul bill. And I guess the concern here is, will this collapse of FTX, this crypto bear market, usher in a wave of regulation that, could go overboard?
There's always the danger when you mix a bear market with an epic failure that has reverberating effects across the entire crypto ecosystem and then spills over into other markets as well. You heard very clearly from the clip that Chair Benham was focused on the registration of exchanges and surveillance of market activity, also the direct relationship with respect to custodians in the space. And I think for quite a long time, regulators sat on the sidelines. Oftentimes, it didn't just have to do with a fundamental lack of understanding, but to let the market kind of bubble up to the surface. But we all know that every time that there is a major deleterious impact to investors and consumers, they can't sit on the sidelines anymore. We saw a lot of legislative initiatives in this current Congress that is about to go out, but we saw a lot of bipartisan support, particularly from the Senate Ag Committee leadership, which means a lot to signal in the future a bipartisan effort to put the screws in to provide the regulatory framework necessary here.
So, Professor Evans, what exactly then can what exactly, I guess, how is FTX going to be judged, if you will? I mean, obviously there are issues about commingling, but again, because it's so murky when it comes to who exactly covers crypto trading spot markets, for instance, what rules can they be ultimately judged?
Well, this is a really challenging question, and we have to sort of reserve comment because as I'm not aware of any charges that have been filed specifically here, but either we have gross negligence at best and fraud at worst. The problem is that the CFTC currently, as the enabling legislation that created and empowered the CFTC to begin with, only allows the CFTC to react, not to be proactive. So couldn't really get ahead of at least the way that the CEA is currently written and the impact of the Dodd-Frank bill or act on regulations to expand during the 2008-2009 era and failure. But as the CEA is written currently, the CFTC doesn't have the type of oversight and its ability to actually regulate this digital spot market. And so I think that Chair Benham was before the Senate imploring it to amend the legislation, the enabling legislation, to give it broader powers in the digital spot market.
But do you think the existing legislation that has been proposed out there could have prevented this collapse? I mean, we have the Digital Commodities Exchange Act, the DCCPA, which Sam Bankman-Fried himself was an advocate for. We also have the Lummis-Gillibrand bill. And this was also a Bahamas-based entity. So what could have the U.S. have done?
Well, to the extent that United States consumers are impacted, there would be a reach. And there's always going to be the problem when, even despite the best efforts of legislators and regulators, that consumers circumvent the protections in place using VPNs and other technology. So as long as consumers in the United States are impacted, there seems to be certainly there's a mandate and a call to protect United States citizens. That being said, I don't know that I have easy answers to the question in terms of the reach. Sam Bankman-Fried, for example, is still in the Bahamas as well. And again, we haven't seen any charges come out, but it is imperative that there are some guardrails and protections for those who continue to use centralized exchanges. There are a lot of reasons why many retail investors don't actually lean into the self-custody, which is really part of the ethos, spirit, and intention of peer-to-peer cash. And so for all of those investors and consumers who are relying on centralized exchanges, we need greater transparency. We were always supposed to have the greater transparency, the public-facing permissionless ledgers, and the like. But now there is the new intermediary creeping up that doesn't have all of the same guidelines that some of the other intermediaries have, and that's going to be a problem for the crypto industry. So
as you brought up the intermediaries, of course, and that would necessarily or most likely lead to some sort of regulation, of course. How do you see it ultimately shaping up? I mean, we just talked a little bit about CFTC not having oversight over the spot markets. The SEC seems to think it should have that. But what will ultimately happen if you had to guess? I mean, this is just shooting in the dark, but try it.
Right. Let's see. Well, the famous philosopher Oprah once said, "There's wisdom in the whisper," favorite. And right, and lessons come to you in a whisper, and then a brick wall. I think we're at the brick wall stage. And it's forcing the hand of legislators to amend legislation. And I am actually cautiously optimistic and hopeful. You started at the top of this block talking about whether or not, or concerns about the overreach. It's always going to be problematic if you have, a sledgehammer instead of a chisel, right? Will it be proper? And by it, I mean regulation and new legislation to enable more robust regulation. Will it be well tailored so that, and I think Chair Benham spoke to this point towards the end of his comments, the sufficient calibration of regulation to empower the CFTC in this particular market, but also not to hamstring it so that the CFTC can be nimble and evolve more quickly with the times and certainly with the technology. So I do see regulation coming. I do think there's a lot of thoughtful consideration to the right balance. And so I'm cautiously optimistic for 2023.
What agency do you think will take it? Will take the spot markets?
Well, it's a challenge to say where the dividing line is. I think we have an existing one, though. If a token or a coin functions as a security, the SEC clearly has jurisdiction over that. If something functions like Bitcoin and ETH clearly as a commodity, then the CFTC should be empowered to regulate there. And back in 2010 or 2014, or that period of time, there was this joint initiative between the SEC and the CFTC about working together. Since 2014, that hasn't been, it's been a bit defunct or quiet. I wonder, and time will tell, if that comes back into full view where the SEC and CFTC work jointly in order to figure out where the dividing line is for this asset class that doesn't function always in the same way. There are almost 22,000 different types of coins and tokens. And so we have to take care, Congress certainly has to take care to make sure that the right legislation and regulation is created for the times.
Professor Evans, I just also want to hear your thoughts on what you thought about Sam Bankman-Fried's latest interview with the New York Times the other day, especially in light of his advocacy for regulation and, this collapse that we've seen from FTX thus far.
There's a lot of conspiracy theories that abound. I'm also an intellectual property lawyer, and I remember when, for example, industry heavily lobbied Congress in order to create amendments to the Copyright Act, for example. So that in and of itself doesn't concern me. I think it's just the sign and the reality of the times. There's a ton of money in politics, and therefore legislative initiatives are going to be impacted by the regulated parties. They have a vested interest in the outcome, and oftentimes we have legislation that is crafted with the input of the industry intended to be regulated. That being said, we always have to be concerned when the money pushes the pen and favors one market player over another. I think that we need to give a little space to see how it all fleshes out. I think there are a lot of great things in that Stabenow-Boozman bill. the Gillibrand and Lummis bill as well. And so it's just because industry players have a role to play in how legislation is crafted doesn't necessarily mean that it is heavily slanted. We shall see.